You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. This week, episode 326, Fort Carlos. Last week we covered some of the closing events of the war as news of the peace treaty and cessation of hostilities arrived in Philadelphia in the spring of 1783. Getting the word out about peace was a lengthy process, though. Some corners of the war continued to do battle. Spain had maintained control of the area around New Orleans throughout the war. It had received the Louisiana Territory from France at the end of the 7 Years' War. When Spain entered the war against Britain in 1779, it looked for any opportunities all over the world to take land from Britain. After Spanish forces under Bernardo de Galvez captured Pensacola in 1781, the British pretty much gave up on West Florida. Spain wanted to use its control of the region to secure control of the Mississippi River. It maintained posts as far north as St. Louis, in what is today Missouri. The region's commander, Governor Bernardo de Galvez, had returned to Spain after his 1781 victory. By 1783, Galvez was back in the West Indies, planning an invasion of Jamaica. Colonel Esteban Rodriguez Miro was serving as acting governor in New Orleans. Miro was the son of a Spanish official born in what is today California. He joined the army at age 16 while the 7 Years' War was raging. Following that war, he received a military education in Spain before transferring to Louisiana in 1778. Miro served as Galvez's aide during the regional fights with the British beginning in 1779. He was a trusted officer who could administer the region from New Orleans. By 1782, the British, as I said, were no longer a military threat in this immediate region. Spanish leaders focused their attention more on the Mississippi River and many of the hostile native forces that contested for control. Further north on the Mississippi River, American forces, specifically George Rogers Clark, operating under the authority of Virginia, was asserting control of areas up to the eastern bank of the Mississippi River. Spain disputed this territory, but seemed content to control the west bank, at least that far north. Further south, in the area around Louisiana, Spain claimed control of the entire region on both sides of the river. Exactly where the lines would be drawn was still in dispute, and that was something that was supposed to be solved by the Treaty of Paris, which we got later in 1783. Spain never allied itself with the Americans against Britain. It generally supported American efforts to attack the British and weaken their enemy, but when American and Spanish interests bumped up against each other, as they are here in the West, the relationship became much more gray. Throw into that mix that British agents were still trying to exert influence, primarily through Indian allies, the lines between allies and enemies got even murkier. By the time the British Army and the regulars had gotten pushed out of the region in 1781, the leader of the opposition to Spain fell to a man of Scottish ancestry named James Logan Colbert. His personal background seems to be a matter of dispute. Some sources say he was born in Scotland, but traveled to Georgia in 1736. One source even claims that he arrived on the same ship as future Continental General Lachlan Mackintosh. This origin story seems to have been pretty heavily called into question. Other sources claim that Colbert was born in the Carolinas. One credible source believes that Colbert was the son of Joseph Calvert, who lived in North Carolina near the Virginia border, and that his last name got changed over time from Calvert to Colbert. I find this story believable since Joseph Calvert had a father-in-law named James Logan, and therefore it would have made sense for him to name his son James Logan Colbert. According to some accounts, Colbert had been a British officer for some time before the war began, but this really seems unlikely too. It could be that he received an informal commission during the war. It could also be that he simply claimed command as a way to get others to follow him. But he did go by Captain Colbert during the war. Whatever his origin, Colbert, who often seems to be called by his middle name of Logan, made his way into the region that is today Arkansas. One account says that he was indentured to an Indian trader named Abe Colson, but however he got there, he began living with the Chickasaw Indians sometime in the late 1730s or early 1740s. He lived with the Chickasaw, became an adopted member of the Chickasaw Nation, and started a family with a Chickasaw woman. Records report that before the war, he, as I said, was an adopted member of the Chickasaw tribe and was also registered as a British Indian trader. Over the years with the Chickasaw, he had 3 wives and 8 children. By 1783, he was in his 60s. He was a well-established figure among the Chickasaw, and he owned his own large inland plantation with 150 slaves. The Chickasaw were a relatively small tribe that had opposed French and Spanish incursions for many generations. In 1752, Colbert participated in a war with his Chickasaw brothers against the French army, which was hoping to wipe out the Chickasaw Nation entirely. At that time, the French had taken 700 French regulars, as well as some Choctaw allies, to eliminate the Chickasaw. And this is sometimes called part of the Second Chickasaw War, because the French had also fought an earlier war with a similar goal in the 1720s. In this instance, and in the prior one, the French were beaten back and ceded the territory to the Chickasaw. Because of their opposition to the French and to the Spanish, once the Spanish replaced the French, the Chickasaw remained allied with Britain, who sometimes provided them with arms and supplies. In 1781, Colbert led a Chickasaw attack on Fort Jefferson, an outpost built by George Rogers Clark's men on Chickasaw land in what is today part of western Kentucky. The attack led to an 8-day siege on the fort, followed by a full-on assault. Although the Chickasaw failed to take the fort, after the battle, Clark abandoned Fort Jefferson, believing it too much of a target for future attacks. Now, Colbert and the Chickasaw seemed more focused on protecting their territory from any outside intrusion, and never really seemed to form a strong alliance with any of the outside nations. In 1782, Colbert was focused on harassing Spanish shipping on the Mississippi River. His fighters consisted not only of his fellow Chickasaw, but others that were described as Englishmen, still others of African descent. In May of 1782, they captured a boat carrying pay and provisions to the Spanish outpost at St. Louis. Among their prisoners was the wife and children of the Spanish commander at St. Louis. Colbert released the commander's family and 9 other prisoners, allowing them to return to New Orleans on parole. The prisoners were on their honor to be exchanged for 9 English prisoners being held by the Spanish at Natchez. Miro refused the exchange. He regarded Colbert not as an enemy combatant, but as a pirate and a criminal, and therefore he wasn't going to make any deals with him. In response, Colbert stepped up his raids on Spanish shipping. The Spanish tried to get their Indian allies to go after Colbert's forces. The Kickapoo attempted several raids, but were largely unsuccessful. Since the British were no real help at this point, Colbert attempted to establish an alliance with the Americans in South Carolina. The response was that the Americans would help only if the Chickasaw ceded some of their lands to them. Colbert refused the deal. In the early months of 1783, Colbert's army seemed to grow, and they seemed to be supplied primarily by the boats that they were able to capture. Colbert decided he wanted to step up the attacks by going after a target on land. The French had originally built the Arkansas post a century earlier. It was about halfway between New Orleans and St. Louis on the Arkansas River, near its junction with the Mississippi River. This post had moved and been abandoned a few times, but was pretty much continuously garrisoned for about the last 50 years. When the Spanish took over, they named it Fort Carlos, after the king, Carlos III of Spain, and they maintained a small garrison of about 20 soldiers. Outside of the fort, a small village had formed with a few dozen families and their slaves. They'd settled around the fort, which also served as a trading post for trappers, hunters, and others who were coming and going to locations further into the west. The fort itself had a pretty formidable set of 13-foot walls made of thick tree trunks. The wall was capable of stopping any small arms fire. It also had 4 cannons to provide firepower against any attack. And I think these were primarily there to be used against any ship trying to make its way up the Arkansas River without authorization. Concerned for the security of the fort, Miraut deployed Captain Jacobo Dubreuil St. Cyr to take command. Dubreuil arrived in January of 1783, and he was no newcomer to the region. For several years prior, Dubreuil had provided military escorts to supply convoys up the river and had commanded a small outpost just south of St. Louis. When he deployed to Fort Carlos, Dubreuil brought reinforcements, bringing the garrison up to 67 Spanish soldiers. He reported that 3 of the 4 wooden gun carriages had rotted and were being replaced. Dubreuil also had his men carve musket slits into the fort walls. The larger garrison needed food stores in case of an attack, so they formed hunting parties to provide meat, which could be dried and stored. The Spanish also had a pretty good relationship with the local Indians from the Quapaw tribe. The Indians served as scouts for the Spanish and also traded with the local trading post. Dubreuil was aware that there could be an attack on the fort, and he used the Quapaw to scout the region and to warn him of any approaching enemy. Dubreuil's belief that an attack on the fort was forthcoming was correct. By mid-April, Colbert had assembled a force to attack the fort. English-speaking Americans made up the bulk of his force. There were about 64 of them. Most of them were loyalists, but there were also a few Whigs in there who didn't like the Spanish controlling the region. There were also 5 African Americans, 11 Chickasaw, some of whom were mixed race and actually relatives of Colbert's, and 1 Frenchman who I don't know why he was there. Colbert hoped to hit the fort by surprise, meaning he had to get his force past the Quapaw village undetected. The men paddled downriver in canoes, using muffled oars at night. They passed the Quapaw village and landed near the fort at around 2:30 a.m. on April 17th. The attackers encountered a 10-man guard near the fort, which they managed to overwhelm, killing 2 defenders and wounding 2 others. The rest were taken prisoner, except for 1 man who managed to flee and warn the fort. Colbert's men had to secure the village, which consisted of 7 families, but within a half an hour, they were at the gates of the fort. Of course, by that time, the garrison was waiting for them. The 2 sides exchanged fire for hours into the morning daylight. The fort's cannons kept the attackers pinned down in a gully where they could at least remain safe from the cannon fire. The attackers' muskets and rifle shots at the fort did little damage, as they could not penetrate the fort walls. By 9 a.m., it was light out, and neither side was having much of an impact on the other. One of the families that Colbert had captured was that of the fort's second-in-command, Lieutenant Louis de Villers. Colbert sent Mrs. Villers under a white flag with a demand to surrender the fort. The demands instructed the fort to surrender by noon, or the attackers would storm the fort supported by 500 Chickasaw warriors. And if they had to storm the fort, they threatened to kill everyone. If the garrison attempted to alert their Quapaw allies, Colbert would kill the families that he had already taken hostage. At the same time, Colbert was delivering his message under a flag of truce. Dubreuil was sending out his own offensive. 10 soldiers and 4 Quapaw warriors rushed out of the gates right past the messenger under its flag of truce and charged directly into the enemy. The Spanish killed one of the attackers and wounded another. The surprised attacking force under Colbert panicked and ran. They returned to their boats, taking their male prisoners with them, but releasing the women and children. By noon, when Colbert had threatened to return with 500 Chickasaw warriors, the Quapaw chief Angasca arrived with 100 of his own warriors to help break the siege and aid the Spanish garrison. With the enemy gone, Dubreuil scolded Angasca for failing to alert the fort to Colbert's arrival and for the many hours it took for him to show up with a pretty small relief force. According to Dubreuil's report, the chief apologized that the attackers had passed his village unnoticed and said that it took time for a fighting force to be raised since most of his men were out hunting by the time he became aware of the situation. It also appears that many Quapaw warriors had no interest in getting involved in a war between two groups of white men. Dubril then deployed 20 of his own soldiers to accompany the 100 Quapaw warriors in search of the enemy and to retrieve their prisoners. About a week later, this party caught up with Colbert's men on the banks of the Mississippi. Because Colbert was part of the Chickasaw tribe and the Quapaw chief Angasca really didn't want to start a war with the Chickasaw, he kept his warriors back and approached Colbert to talk. He told Colbert that he had about 250 warriors, more than double his actual numbers, and that he was going to attack unless they could come to an agreement. After some discussion, Colbert released most of his prisoners, including Lieutenant Villars. He still held back 8 prisoners, 4 Spanish soldiers, 3 slaves, and 1 child, and he told Lieutenant Villars, who was being given parole, that he expected the Spanish to release 5 loyalists who were still being held at Natchez in exchange. Now, unbeknownst to everyone involved in this matter, word of the peace treaty had already arrived in the West Indies. General Galvez had ordered the parole of the Natchez prisoners on the condition that they leave Natchez forever. So the parolees that Colbert was trying to have released were already on a ship headed for British Jamaica. For the next few weeks, though, Dubril, still unaware of the treaty, continued to track Colbert's forces. He considered Colbert a pirate, and he wanted to catch and execute this English criminal. Colbert continued to attack the Spanish shipping along the Mississippi. On May 11th, a Spanish convoy spotted Colbert's camp. Dubril's men attacked as Colbert's men withdrew. The Spanish managed to kill a few of them, including Colbert's second-in-command. The attackers also managed to free 3 of the prisoners that Colbert had taken from Fort Carlos. A few days later, word arrived from New Orleans about the peace treaty. It included a newspaper that announced the treaty, as well as an English translation of the treaty itself. Dubril had instructions to parley with Colbert and inform him of the end of the war. When he did, Dubril sent out a messenger which included a letter demanding the release of the rest of his prisoners taken at Fort Carlos and for reimbursement of the supplies stolen by the raiders. By this time, however, Colbert and his men were in full retreat. It took him nearly 4 months to receive the letter from Dubril. When he finally received it, he replied that he would release the prisoners, but also inquired about the Chickasaw prisoners still being held by the Spanish in St. Louis. Colbert wasn't ready to pay for the supplies he had taken, but said he would consult with the British governor in St. Augustine. By that time, the Chickasaw had already made their own peace with Spain. They had reached out to Dubril at Fort Carlos in August, telling the Spanish commander that the Chickasaw were prepared to live in peace with Spain and that they had disowned Colbert and his family. Colbert, finding himself on the losing end of the war, wasn't sure what to do. In July 1783, several months after his attack on Fort Carlos, Colbert wrote a letter to Virginia Governor Benjamin Harrison. His letter tried to downplay his loyalist reputation and said that his fight was with the Spanish and the French. He was an American, and he supported the Americans. Colbert's main concern in the letter was that he wanted the Chickasaw to have a good relationship with the Americans, as they all would likely continue to struggle against the Spanish. By all appearances, Colbert had already learned that Americans had won the war, and he was looking to be a part of the winning side for both himself and the Chickasaw. Colbert never received a response from Governor Harrison. In January of 1784, Colbert was riding through West Florida. And it's unclear he'd either been to St. Augustine to discuss matters with the British there, or he had been meeting with the Creeks in Georgia, or maybe both. In a letter dated January 7th, Alexander McGilvery, the son of a Scottish father and a Creek mother, wrote to Captain Arturo O'Neill, who was serving with the Spanish and employed in fighting the Chickasaw. McGilvery wrote that Colbert had been killed. He had been returning to the Chickasaw Nation, and while traveling through West Florida, in modern-day Alabama, his horse threw him, killing him instantly. Now, there's been some speculation that Colbert was actually killed by a slave who was riding with him, or perhaps even at the instigation of Chickasaw chiefs who saw Colbert as an impediment to them being able to reach a peaceful settlement with Spanish officials. Whatever the true reason, Colbert was dead. For everyone else, the war was over, and it was time to make peace. Next week, though, Continental soldiers march on Philadelphia, and they are not happy. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. Thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis, Mike Hager, John Celentano, and Michael Mulhern. Thanks to Robert Morris Circle supporters, Richard McCabe and TJ Walker. I also want to welcome Don Venditto, who joined on Patreon at the Privy Council level. Like all my Patreon supporters at the $10 level or higher, Don will receive a magnet with a different flag from the American Revolution each month. Don also made a generous one-time gift via PayPal, as did Jeff Wise, and I thank you both for that. I also want to mention that we will restart our live roundtable on Zoom this week. Our discussion will cover the powder alarm of September 1774, since we just passed its 250th anniversary. Now, this is a discussion about the issues that were taking place in Massachusetts in those tense months before the battles of Lexington and Concord. If you are on my mailing list or on Patreon, you should have received an invitation. If you want to be informed of future events, please sign up for my mailing list. Now, this week, the attack on Fort Carlos is arguably the last battle of the Revolutionary War that was fought in North America. There would be a little more conflict in other parts of the world, and we'll discuss that in a future episode. And we also still have the British occupation of New York, but spoiler alert, that's coming to an end, and there's not going to be any violence over it. So for the Americans, the war was pretty much over. As part of the treaty, Britain had given up not only West Florida, which Spain already occupied, but also East Florida, which the British very much still did occupy, to Spain. It would not be until 1785 that Britain would finally evacuate St. Augustine, but the entire Floridas were going to be turned over to the Spanish. For the Indians, there would be no end to the conflict. The Chickasaw made a tentative peace with the Spanish, who now had undisputed control of the land west of the Mississippi, as well as the Gulf Coast. Captain Dubreuil remained in command of Fort Carlos, rising to the rank of lieutenant colonel. Much of his work ended up turning more toward civil service type jobs, approving marriages, wills, land grants. He also helped search for escaped slaves and tried to maintain the alliance with the Quapaw tribe. In 1787, Dubreuil would be transferred to the larger Fort San Marcos in West Florida, near the modern-day city of Tallahassee, and while there he managed to survive a siege by an army of Creeks, Seminoles, and others, who were led by a British officer named William Augustus Bowles, better known as Captain Billy. Bowles was trying to create an independent Native American state named Muskogee. A Spanish relief fleet arrived and broke the siege, so Dubreuil was rescued from the attack, and he would end up dying of natural causes a couple of years later. Now, as I said in the main show, Colbert died in 1784, but his legacy did live on. Several of his sons led the Chickasaw for decades to follow. William Colbert, or Chusahemataha, fought with the U.S. against the Creeks, and he met with President George Washington, where he received a commission, and led Chickasaw warriors in support of Anthony Wayne at Fallen Timbers. He also served as an American officer in the War of 1812, and met with President John Adams and signed several peace treaties on behalf of the Chickasaw with the U.S. His brother, Levi Colbert, or Itawamba Minko, became a prominent plantation owner in what is today Mississippi. Levi also fought under General Andrew Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans and served as a chief in the Chickasaw Nation. Another of James Colbert's sons, George Colbert, who was only a teenager when his father died, also became an important leader among the Chickasaw. Under the leadership of George Colbert and his brothers, the Chickasaw became pretty close American allies. Colbert served under Arthur Sinclair and Anthony Wayne in the Northwest Indian Wars of the 1790s. Under his leadership, the Chickasaw formed a small army that fought alongside Andrew Jackson in the wars against the Creek Indians. The Colberts and these same warriors, as I said, also fought under Andrew Jackson in the War of 1812 against the British. During peacetime, George Colbert became a large and powerful cotton planter in what is today northern Alabama. His Chickasaw tribe communally owned 150 slaves who worked in the cotton fields. Now, despite their long support for American interests, the Colberts and the Chickasaw were ordered to abandon their plantations and move west to Oklahoma, making room for white settlers in Alabama in the 1830s. George Colbert died on the Trail of Tears shortly before the rest of his Chickasaw tribe reached their new home in what is today Oklahoma. My book recommendation this week is James Colbert and His Chickasaw Legacy by Stephen L. Kling, Jr. It's an interesting and in-depth look at Colbert and his role in the Revolutionary War. Kling's work is actually pretty short, under 100 pages, and the rest of the book is padded out by another older article by Guy Braden that looks at Colbert's children and their impact on American history. The book is pretty new, first published in 2022. The author, Stephen Kling, is an attorney from St. Louis who has written several books and articles on the Revolutionary War in the West. So if you want more on this week's topic, you can get a copy of James Colbert and His Chickasaw Legacy by Stephen Kling. My online recommendation is called The Arkansas Post Story by Roger Coleman. This is a booklet, but it's actually longer than the book I recommended this week, and it covers the entire history of the Arkansas Post, which is Fort Carlos, from the original French establishment to its destruction during the Civil War, and then the establishment of a national memorial there in 1929. It gives a good deal of coverage to the revolutionary events that I discussed this week. The booklet was published in 1987 as a publication for the National Park Service. So, as a government document, it's in the public domain and therefore freely available on archive.org. As always, I've included direct links on my blog and website. And my question this week comes from Patrick Gallagher, who asks, were people in Britain allowed to immigrate to the colonies during the war, or was that almost seen as treason? Or was it a case that technically the colonies were still British, so it was just people moving about Britain? Also, were the loyalists allowed to freely sell their lands and sail for Britain, or did they need to move in the dead of night? Given the cost and danger of the Atlantic, did most just head for New York or Canada? Well, Patrick, there was very little in the way of immigration laws in the 18th century. As long as you were willing to become the subject of the king who ruled the region, you could move pretty much anywhere and become a subject. So, yeah, people in Britain could move to the British colonies or anywhere else they wanted to live. There were, in fact, lots of Germans who were moving to the British colonies during the colonial era and becoming British subjects. And while there was no legal barrier to move just about anywhere, British subjects tended to move to British colonies, not to Spanish, French, Dutch, or other colonies. The differences in language, religion, and cultural barriers prevented them from moving to many other places. So people from Britain very commonly moved to and from the colonies before the war, but it was pretty much like entering a different world, even if it was all technically ruled by the king. Now, during the war itself, I don't know of any actual prohibition on moving to America. After all, Britain still considered them British colonies, and during various times during the war, the British controlled significant territories within the colonies. As a matter of practicality, though, no one really wants to move into a war zone. Wars led to chaos and danger. If you picked the wrong side, you could lose your property and maybe even your life. Many colonists who could left the colonies for Britain or other parts of the empire because those areas were at peace. As I said, nobody wants to move to a war zone. At the very beginning of the war, there were some loyalists who were able to sell their property and simply leave. The problem, of course, is that selling in a time of war usually meant selling at a huge loss. People's property was their entire life savings, and without it, they would have nothing to live on. Most loyalists tried to hang on to their land until it was too late, and a great many of them had to flee in the dead of night, as you say, to avoid being attacked by mobs or facing arrest by patriot governments. And many didn't even leave then and were in fact attacked by mobs or arrested by patriot governments. As you note in your question, transatlantic travel was always very difficult and expensive during this era, but especially during a war when there was a threat of privateers or enemy naval vessels who also posed a great risk. The British Navy largely blockaded civilian shipping, so you'd need approval by the British Navy to travel, which of course subjected you to attack by the other side. As a result, there just wasn't much non-military shipping between Britain and the colonies during the war. And what little there was usually went through New York, or perhaps some area that might be under British control at certain times during the war, like Charleston, South Carolina, or Newport, Rhode Island. The result was that most loyalists who were forced out of their homes by the Patriots moved to Canada, particularly those who lived in the North or Middle colonies. Those in the Southern colonies, some went to East Florida, some went to Caribbean islands that were British territories, and some of them even went to Canada because moving to the Caribbean or East Florida was a very dangerous thing in and of itself because of the tropical diseases that killed many people who arrived there. Many of the Loyalists also, of course, went to New York City, which was under British control for almost the entire war. The Loyalists, wherever they went, if they were men of fighting age, they were usually expected to join Loyalist regiments and join in the fight to retake the colonies for the crown. So as far as leaving the colonies during the war, there really was a wide variety of experiences. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me either via email or on Twitter, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.